up all the changes in art. Now, the only thing we have to left to do in this giant chapter, and I apologize for it, it's the way the College Board designed it. The last thing we need to do is the rise of the West, the new West, right? Um, we've already kind of talked about how the Western world, the European world, is rising up. Now we're going to specifically look at a little bit of the United States of America and a few other changes, a few other places that are starting to develop. Um, this is not an APUS class, so we don't go super in depth in U.S. history, but that's next year. You learn more about those things. So the New West, post-Civil War, we talked about the Civil War already. The post-Civil War, the United States of America is going to grow as a leader in industry and science, arguably the leader of the Second Industrial Revolution, especially concerning electricity. Uh, Electricity is something we talked about before, and we finally figured out a way to harness it and generate it in a consistent way. And then it just became, what can we do with this? And we talked about those inventions before. Research labs start popping up across the United States of America, inspired by Prussian research labs. So the Germans were kind of an early leader in that, but we copied it and then ran with it and went even further. Two early leaders you've probably heard of before, Nikola Tesla and Thomas Edison. Tesla worked for Edison briefly. He made a improved electrical motor for Edison. So he worked for Edison's labs, and Edison promised him a large sum of money if Tesla could invent a new motor. Tesla did make this new motor, and then Edison laughed at him and said, "You don't understand our American sense of humor," when Tesla came and asked for his money. Tesla was massively insulted, and I mean, arguably, he was screwed over. I mean, this is terrible. Like that's bad business and should have been sued. But whatever. Tesla was a Eastern European immigrant to the United States of America. No court would have sided with him at this time period. So he is upset about his treatment from Edison. He leaves Edison, and he ends up getting contracts from another American businessman named Westinghouse. You might still have Westinghouse appliances in your home. So anyways, Tesla's going to go out. The big division that develops between these two people is AC versus DC current, electrical current. Nikola Tesla is going to work a lot with alternating current, AC current, whereas Edison's going to promote DC current. Today, we use both of them. These men, their inspiration, are going to basically give us our electrical grid and all of the electrical devices we have today. Alternating current is what comes into your house. It's what comes out of the wall. But if any of your devices, like your phone and your laptops and Chromebooks and those sort of things, if any of your devices are plugged into the wall, they first have to go through a transformer. These things are really small today, right? But you still have to plug in something to the wall that transforms that alternating current, AC current, into DC, direct current, which is what devices use, our computers and phones and whatever. That's what they use. We use both of these currents, but that both of these men really invented with and created. Alternating current, better for going longer distances. Direct current doesn't transfer very far as well. It doesn't do as well for transferring long distances, but it's more reliable and can be used better for electrical circuits. So we use both of them still to this day. They hated each other during their lives, and this rivalry, I guess, we kind of benefited from. They came up with new inventions, but they did hate each other. Some famous stories came out of it, and they're true, but Edison, working with DC, wanted to prove that AC was more dangerous, which it can be. AC can be very dangerous. Please don't play with electricity. But he invents an electric chair to show that alternating current. He uses alternating current in his electrical chair. So Edison builds an electric chair to prove that Tesla's AC is dangerous and that it can kill people. So Thomas Edison, in a way, creates the electric chair. Thomas Edison also uses alternating current to kill an elephant. He electrocutes an elephant, and then he uses his new video camera technology, which he largely created, to electrocute an elephant. The elephant was a murderer, so it was sentenced to die. I don't know if that makes it any better, but if you want to, you can find that video online. It's one of the oldest videos ever taken, and it is an elephant being electrocuted. He smokes. I don't know if it's he or she, but the elephant smokes and basically catches on fire and dies. That was all to try to disprove and discredit Tesla. I'm telling you these stories because they hated each other, but we did benefit from it. So other people are doing other researches as well too, chemistry, all these other things. America is becoming a leader in science and technology. Our economic system of capitalism and laissez-faire government policy, remember hands-off economic policies, our government was not really involved in business or anything, gave huge incentive to developing new technology. If you could come up with a new technology, you could monopolize it, be the only person who owns it, and then have total control over it. As a result, you can make a massive amount of money. Some of the richest people to ever live will live in America at this time period. So you've probably heard of I mentioned Andrew Carnegie before, but you've probably heard of Rockefeller. He's incredibly wealthy. The Vanderbilts. Some of these people are going to become ridiculously wealthy during this time period, and as a result, there was a large push for new technology and new research. So America is leading the second industrial revolution. However, culturally, we're viewed as being kind of a backwater. We were lagging behind, with the exception of maybe Mark Twain. There were no real American artists or authors who were very popular outside of the United States of America. Maybe Walt Whitman. For the most part, America was viewed as a cultural backwater. We might have had the greatest science and technology, better guns and better stuff like that, but you wouldn't go to America for fashion or music or art. Meanwhile, the United States of America, post-Civil War, constantly pushing west. The U.S. is going to grow and become larger than any European country. Okay, yes, I get Russia's big, but most of it was still empty, and still to this day, it's not 100% useful, whereas the United States of America is a massive country with a large amount of natural resources, and most of it is livable. We also had a very internal economy. We didn't rely on other countries. Europeans were heavily interconnected because they've been developed nations for thousands of years, and at this point, hundreds of years at least. And so these European countries were much more connected, and they needed each other. America needed America, and so we were very self-reliant. We had all of this territory, which we conquered, of course, largely killing the Native American populations and subjugating the people who were here instead. We fought a war against Mexico, took over this land here. Which we'll talk about again later when we talk about Latin America stuff, but all of this area here, about 5 states over here, and then of course Texas, this area we took from Mexico. We made an agreement with England, which prevented war, to basically develop the border over here. And of course, then around the Civil War time, we also purchased Alaska from Russia. So this is all land we basically started to grow to. So America becomes a monstrous country that's more united and is a leading technological powerhouse. Meanwhile, we already kind of talked about this before, America was also a pressure valve. So think of a pressure valve like a steam engine. You're building up all that steam, all that energy that could possibly explode. Well, if a European country had all these problems and all these things that might possibly cause a revolution or explosion, most of the times the people just fled and went to America. And so the United States of America, the Western world, the new Western world, was a pressure valve for Europe and all of the social problems of Europe. Jewish people suffering from pogroms in Russia came to the United States of America. So we have a large Russian Jewish population in the United States of America. You've probably heard of the Irish potato famines, right? So in the 1840s especially, we see potatoes coming out of the ground with a fungus that was rotting them. You didn't know that the potatoes were rotten until harvest time. People starved to death. Millions of Irish people will flee to the United States of America. Germans, meanwhile, came to the United States of America, oftentimes brought money and brought factories and brought machinery with them. And so Germans bring a lot of industrial know-how and moved into different areas. And so we see a lot of immigrants coming to the United States of America, and this also helped prevent more revolutions from taking place in Europe. If America closed its borders, who could say? Lots of things could have changed a lot differently. There might have been more revolutions in Europe. Meanwhile, the U.S. is growing in population. We have this giant empty country. Empty, I mean, except for the Native Americans who were being killed, and the United States of America starts growing. Downfall for the United States of America, slightly, I guess so, is that immigrants prevented the rise of socialism in the United States of America. We did not need to treat our workers as nicely as the Germans, the French, and the English did because we didn't need them. If you didn't like the job, you're fired. We'll find an immigrant who will do the job for half of your pay. You'll learn more about this next year in APUS. There were a lot of political organizations that were very racist and very anti-immigrant. The KKK is an anti-immigrant organization as well as being anti-African American. They're anti-Catholic because a lot of the immigrants coming from Italy and places were also Catholic. A lot of their beliefs were also because immigrants were hurting the ability of the American working class to get better pay and to have better wages. So there's a lot of there's going to be a lot of anti-immigrant stuff. Once again, you'll learn that next year in APUS. Go through those things. But because of immigration, we didn't have socialism in the United States of America, and Europe didn't have revolutions. Meanwhile, and we'll talk more about this with imperialism in later chapters, but Australia started to become used. This is another part of the New West, right? We see white people in Australia now. After the American Revolution, Australia will be used as a place where England dumps its social problems. If you have pickpockets and prostitutes and petty criminals, rather than have these people take up jail cells, dump them on the other side of the world, and basically use them as a labor force in Australia. And so Australia starts to be settled by England as a way of England getting rid of its social problems. They're putting them somewhere else. Before Australia, obviously, they used the United States of America. A lot of indentured servants came over because they were prisoners. This is going to cause a population boom in Australia, which before was considered terra nullius, the empty land. But people start settling along the coasts, originally prisoners. They treat the native people there terribly. Until the 20th century, mid 20th century, in Australia, the Aboriginal people, the native people of Australia, were considered animals by law. They were not considered human beings. Aboriginal children were usually separated from their families at young ages, and the people were treated horrendously. So that's an Aboriginal. Ignore this guy for a second. We'll talk about him later. So yeah, the original settlers of Australia were prisoners, so watch your wallets when you go to Australia. Joking, that's from The Simpsons. But they originally were prisoners, and they treated the native people very, very horrendously. Some extreme cases of racism. Not saying the United States was perfect or better. It's in many ways very similar. Meanwhile, though, after that, after the original settlement by the prisoners, you start to see free settlers move there once tin and copper and other metal resources are found in Australia, and people start to move into Australia, settling it, and once again, that will be terrible for the Aboriginal people. They try doing the same thing with New Zealand. So England takes over, or tries to take over New Zealand. However, they fail, and a big part of that has to do with the Maori people. The Maori people are an interesting group. They have a strong warrior culture, and they had also purchased firearms. So New Zealand and Australia, even though they're very similar, and a lot of times in America we probably get those places confused, they do have a slightly different history. While as England will be able to conquer Australia and the largely isolated Aboriginal people, New Zealand, the Maori people will fight them back. They will conquer it eventually, but in doing so, they had to make a lot of peace treaties with the Maori people. And as a neat thing, we sort of see a mixture of the cultures that still exist today. So face tattoos have kind of fallen out of popularity, but they still exist. The Maoris would oftentimes have face tattoos, but also the idea of like the haka is still a part of Maori culture, and is still with us here in New Zealand to this day. This is the rugby team, the All Blacks. They are European descent and Maori descent people. I mean, there's some white people here too, so probably English settler descent people mixed in with the Maori descended people, and they are all doing the haka, the traditional warrior dance and storytelling dance of the Maori people. So it's still a part of the culture. If you have ever seen the movie Moana, a couple of times in the movie, like when they're going into the realm of the monsters, Maui does a haka dance. Haka is a way of intimidating your enemies, so they would do this before sporting events, still to this day. But also it's a way of telling stories. Sometimes it does look very aggressive and angry, but sometimes it can be very sentimental. If you go on YouTube, you can find haka dances for funerals. One popular one that made the rounds on the internet for a while was about school students doing it for a teacher who had died, and it's very moving. And also after, unfortunately, the shooting at the mosque in New Zealand was a year or two ago now, Christchurch. After that one, the students did a haka for their fallen Muslim students, their friends. So it's very touching, even though it can be seeming very aggressive and very angry. It actually can be done for sentimental storytelling reasons as well too. So Maori people still exist. Their history is a little different compared to a lot of other people who were conquered during this time period. All right, recap, but last real slide here. So all of this stuff, all of the Age of Revolution is leading us to World War I. Now that's, hindsight. We can look back and say that was happening then, but nobody would have known, right? It's a century, the 19th century, the Age of Revolution is a century of rapid change and chaos. Social changes, socialism and communism, all of these things are happening. Meanwhile, nationalism is rising up. We talked about nationalism already. We see new countries breaking off of the Ottoman Empire, Greece, and then other places popping up. People are starting to argue that their country is the best, Germany and France and all these places. That's going to, and also racial nationalism and anti-Semitism is rising. So nationalism is causing a big issue, and that's going to be a leading cause of World War I. Imperialism, haven't talked about it yet, but imperialism is leaving an imbalance in power, and we'll talk about that in the next unit. in later chapters here. Industrialization leads directly to imperialism, so we'll talk about that next. Industrialization leads to mass production of war materials. We're going to call this militarism later, but we see the ability now to make machine guns and to make bigger ships and bigger cannons, and cannons that are so big that they have to ride on trains. Just ridiculous weapons are going to start popping out, and all of the industrial era basically gave us the ability to kill humans in a way that the world had never seen before. Europe, meanwhile, is going to start splitting into two alliances during the late 19th century. We see the Triple Alliance of Germany, Austria, and Italy. That's eventually Italy will drop out, but these are the central powers in World War I. We'll talk about that later. And then we see the Triple Entente of England, Russia, and France. Basically, the we don't like the central powers country alliance. So Europe is splitting into two alliances. Industrialization is giving us the ability to kill a bunch of people. Imperialism and nationalism is creating cultural rivalries between different parts of the world. What could possibly go wrong? So recap. 19th century, the age of the revolution. Simply put, the world changed. The entire world had multiple different revolutions. There were multiple different changes. Exponential technological and scientific growth in a very short period of time. The way we viewed the world changed. Our science changed. Everything changed. The way we worked changed. Political revolutions reshaped the view and the role of government. We started to see people saying we don't need kings and queens anymore. That was the norm for most of human history. It's only the last couple hundred years that we've changed that. New countries, like America, but new countries were created during this time period. The United States of America, which is a young country, starts to rise as a new world power and is becoming a technological leader. We'll talk more about America more in the 20th century. Theory of progress is also developed during this time period, and we still have this to this day. We are hopeful. We believe that the world can be improved by human actions and thoughts, that we can improve ourselves. That kind of came out of the Enlightenment and humanism, the idea that we can improve ourselves. But also, there is no problem. This is the theory of progress. There is no problem we can't solve. Today, we learn about problems. We hear about problems in society all the time, whether it's climate change or the coronavirus. But most of us are comforted by the fact that we believe in progress, that we can solve these problems, that there's no problem that is insurmountable. That's the theory of progress. Now, people do start to challenge and question these ideas in the 20th century, especially post-nuclear war and during the Cold War. We do start to challenge the idea of the theory of progress. The theory of progress really is a powerful force in human history. The idea that we can fix anything and make things better through science and chemistry, better living through chemistry. Not everyone's sold on these changes. The Luddites failed, right? We talked about them, but now they see early rumblings for communism, and that's going to cause some issues in the 20th century. But we'll talk about that in later videos.